We are getting closer and closer to a full-blown military intervention within Niger, Africa. Now, obviously, we do not want this to happen, but it's definitely heading in that direction. Now, what's interesting to me is people just assume as long as the French military is involved and all of ECOWAS goes in on Niger, Africa, things are going to be okay. We'll get the president back and we'll go back to normal life. The only issue is that is not the case. Now, in this video, we're going to go over what the actual professional military of Niger, like their actual strengths and their numbers, but let's be honest, beyond that, the true strength of Niger, Africa are all of the aspects surrounding the country. You have a population who's willing to fight, you have a very difficult terrain, you also have the neighboring country of Nigeria who's hating this. Their population is actually suffering because of all of this intervention or not intervention. So let's go ahead and get into this video, and I hope we can all learn something together. Now, first things first, let's actually acknowledge the fact that Niger does have a professional military. A lot of them were actually trained by the French and the United States, unironically. So this is in 2023. You have a country ranked 119 out of 145. Not the worst, not the best, but in all reality, it's pretty bad. Okay, let's just be honest with ourselves here. Now, the number that most big media outlets are going to focus on is the manpower aspect. Now, whenever you look into these military comparison charts, take it with the biggest grain of salt you've ever seen in your life. You got to be careful because China is going to be ranked number 2. But in all honesty, how could China be ranked number 2 when they've never had any combat experience like in a while, almost since like the Vietnam War? You know what I'm saying? So just take this all with a grain of salt. But I want to show you the actual numbers. That you have a population of 24 million people with available fighting manpower of 7.3 million. Now, what's interesting is that number that was about 114 jumps up to 65. Okay, so this is the true number that are ready to fight. Fit for service, 4.9 million. But the active personnel, you have 10,000 active personnel with 13,000 total fighters. Again, terrible numbers, but still you do have a professional fighting force. You have the paramilitary, you have an air force, you have army personnel, and you have no navy, but that doesn't mean anything because there's no naval component to be fighting in this conflict. So again, I'm just showing you all of this so you can see the numbers on screen that there is a professional fighting force. Now, I found an article that actually underlies what the true issue is here with ECOWAS saying, well, just go on in, we'll overturn the government. Look, even the United States, every single time we wanted to do this throughout history, it's been nearly impossible. The only time it's ever worked really was World War II. Not flawlessly, but it actually was a quick turnover of power. But experts doubt the feasibility of a high-risk and difficult-to-implement military operation, the standby force, which is like this. They're calling the standby force this collection of ECOWAS who's on standby in case any country needs military intervention. It was mandated by ECOWAS for missions related to peacekeeping. Okay, so peacekeeping is something different than intervention, because when you go in for an intervention, you're trying now to get the president who's being held, you're trying to overthrow the junta, and you're trying to get people on your side within the country of Niger. But there's, again, some more underlying issues here involving the French who are working with ECOWAS. However, ECOWAS has never agreed on the type of specific mission that these forces should carry out. The establishment of such a force depends on the will of the contributors, which again, so now you have these foreign militaries who are going to risk their lives to go into Niger. Now, this might work out. Later in this video, you'll start to see how Nigeria is suffering and they can use this motivation for their own people to justify or to validate military intervention. And of course, we will get into the other aspects of why Niger, Africa, again, it's going to be, I'm going to say a 99.9% impossible task for any of this to work. I am really willing to stick my neck that far out. Senegal, Benin, Nigeria, and Cote d'Ivoire have said they are ready to send troops, but face internal criticism and hesitation from other West African countries. Basically, the African Standby Force was not designed to restore constitutional order in a country where there was such putsch. Again, this was the same critique for U.S. soldiers who go overseas and they're trying to restore the government, to protect the government. Soldiers are meant to fight. Beyond that, it really belongs to the people in education to try bringing everything together. In addition, it is difficult to release personnel in these armies which are fragile and lack means, according to him. For the time being, only Cote d'Ivoire had specified the number of troops it would be ready to commit to such an intervention. 1,000 men. So again, you have 1,000 guys from Cote d'Ivoire, which is not really a lot. Because consider this, perfect segue. Check this out.
Thousands of mostly young men massed outside a stadium in Niger's capital Niamey on Saturday in a show of support for the military junta that has taken control of the country, and answering a call for people willing to volunteer for non-military roles in defense against a possible intervention by West African powers. So many turned up that organizers were overwhelmed and had to halt the census. Organizers of the recruitment drive said they did not intend to sign up volunteers for the army, but rather to gather a list of people willing to lend their civilian skills in case ECOWAS, the main regional bloc, attacks.
Now, I know some of you are saying, well, what's the big deal? These guys are not going to be fighting in the military. I mean, these are volunteers to fight in a non-military role. Where does that make sense? Well, consider this. The main targets that ECOWAS said that they want to provide and do or go in on is going to be the presidential palace. This is where Mohamed Bazoum allegedly is being held right now. This is where the junta are operating out of. And also, another major target would be the airport. Now, when you have tens of thousands of volunteers who are playing a non-military role, these people can just stand in the way of a military, can slow people down, can just stand in the runway so nobody can use the runway. No military action can be used on the runway. These people could storm an embassy like they're doing with the French. They can mess with other troops. So being in a non-military role is extremely vital beyond like working in logistics or being a medical personnel. You have to think a little bit outside the box of how Niger could really use these tens and thousands of people, because ultimately the final target is going to be the capital of Niger, Niamey. This is where all the decisions are made, just like, going to Baghdad or going to Kabul. Once you take the capital, that is, the end of everything. Something else to consider is that the terrain in Niger is very unforgettable. It's mostly a desert country and open plains. You have dunes, you have dust kicking up. So this terrain, you would think, well, it's open ground, we can face the enemy. But let's be honest, the enemy can see everything you're doing. So you're open for ambushes, you're open, people can see how many troops you have. You have no element of surprise, especially with these ground forces trying to push towards the capital, because trying to do an air campaign, I don't see working out, especially if Niger is willing to put civilians on, in and around locations where neighboring countries are not going to target, because then that would be a very bad thing, and then you'd actually be breaking the rules of war. So consider also the terrain in Niger is very difficult. Now, there's also an element that many people don't really think about, but this is massive. And I mean, this is why the U.S. military is there, is that all of these red spots, now you can't say the word on YouTube because it's really annoying on here. Those are spots where really bad people do really bad things. And I hope you are smart enough to understand what I'm talking about. And the Sahel region in Africa is notorious for these really bad people to attack very vulnerable people, if you catch my drift. Niger is a hotspot for this to happen. So and by the way, these really bad people have been operating at the time of making this video over 30 plus days wherever they want. So this map really is useless almost, but I'm just trying to show you that in 2021, these are the locations where most of these attacks happen. Understand, now that these bad guys are roaming free, they're all over Niger. They're ready to take over. They're ready to retake over a takeover. So consider, even if everything happens to work out, if ECOWAS, if France managed just to walk on in there and they control the country, guess what? For the last 30 days plus, at the time of making this video, at the time of all this is happening, these militant groups have been roaming free. So now they got to deal with that. And this was one of the major reasons as to why the country even fell apart. They didn't like Mohamed Bazoum's policy in attacking or defending the country of Niger. And they were just calling him a French puppet, looking for French interests and not really protecting the people of Niger. The junta, who are in charge now, again, that was one of their main criticism, is that they are in charge to help secure the country. But guess what? Security is not happening. Now, another aspect that we do need to look into is that the neighboring country, Nigeria, is suffering really bad. And this actually might work in favor of Nigeria and not good for Niger, because it almost looks like this is being used as motivation to push into Niger or to justify this military intervention. And the only reason why I'm throwing this into the video is so you guys are getting an understanding of where the people of Nigeria, how they're feeling about the sanctions of Niger.
Market in Kano, Nigeria is the largest cereal market in Africa. Alhaji Ibrahim has recently rendered 3/4 of his staff redundant. Before the border closure with Niger, some 50 handlers were preparing tons of bags of beans every day. But the measure have this major traders' business overnight.
Honestly, we're all unhappy, both our customers and us, the suppliers. We can't supply goods until we've received given orders, and they can't make profit until we deliver. So we're all stuck.
So what's interesting now is that all of these sanctions that were slapped on Niger, it's sort of showing why Niger falling to a coup was a terrible thing, because all of these countries in ECOWAS, they all work together in co-unity to trade amongst one another, to secure one another, to boost and up one another's economies. And now that you have the country of Nigeria kind of not necessarily falling apart, but people are starting to really feel the effects of trying to save Niger, you could assume and make an educated guess the other countries who are also sanctioning Niger are feeling the same type of way. Now, consider this as well. Niger is also feeling the hurt of sanctions, and it's only motivating their own people to want to fight, to want to enlist, to fight against the French, to fight against Nigeria, to fight against ECOWAS. And of course, the last and final aspect that we are forgetting about is that Mali and Burkina Faso are prepared to defend Niger. They are supporting the coup. Now, of course, another major superpower who's also supporting the coup is all the way in Russia. Now, recently, Russia has started to work with North Korea, and Russia is really on this campaign of working with enemies of the West, working with countries who want to be their own thing, to escape the grips and the power of the West, because Russia as well, we're fighting against the West. Let's all work together, guys. And Mali and Burkina Faso, they like Russia. A lot of other African countries like Russia, and there are definitely a lot of tonalities or tones of working with the Russians. I mean, Niger, before Wagner essentially sort of collapsed, they were reaching out to Wagner saying, hey, why don't you guys help us out? But nonetheless, there is an open line of communication between the junta to Mali, to Burkina Faso, who have direct means and lines directly to Russia, who do pay for security forces, especially Mali, with Wagner Group and other Russian contractors. So this is another major aspect that you have to remember why this intervention, in my opinion, is not going to work out, especially in the long run. So that's essentially the video and the breakdown. I try to make this super surface level so you guys get an idea to sort of focus away from this big military aspect of Niger versus Nigeria versus ECOWAS versus Ghana and all this stuff versus Costa Ivory. This means nothing. The other aspects that go into Niger, Africa mean a lot. The people's motivations, the terrain, the allies who are willing to fight, anti-French. We can't stand the French. But at the end of the day, what I also find interesting is that the United States is just sitting in the middle of all of this, hoping nothing happens. The last thing they want is another Vietnam conflict, because guess what? They're already dealing with Vietnam, potentially in another Vietnam conflict. So anyway, that's the video. Sticking to Niger, Africa. This is my opinion and my breakdown on most of this. I do think there will be a military intervention, but I do think it's going to be extremely detrimental to the region, and it's going to open up a vacuum for other major superpowers to try and capture Niger, whether that's Russia, whether that's the United States, whether that's other neighboring African nations. We'll see what happens, but either way, we don't want military intervention.